Well, people are quiet. We might as well begin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Charles Reed. I'm the Dean of the School of Education. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the school and of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I'd like to welcome you to the 5th annual Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. This lecture series is endowed in honor of Charlotte Zolotow, an alumna of this university. Ms. Zolotow studied English with Helen C. White, for whom the building just across the street is named. At the time, there were members of the English department who believed that the phrase children's literature was an oxymoron, that there could not be fine literature written for children. I don't want to slander Helen White by attributing this belief to her, but it was certainly held by many of her contemporaries and perhaps even some people today. Despite the doubters, Charlotte Zolotow went on from here to become a distinguished editor and author of what is undoubtedly children's literature, including more than 65 picture books of her own. Ms. Zolotow is not able to be here in person tonight, but I understand that she may be tuning in to the webcast from her home in New York. We hope so. And if you're there, welcome Charlotte Zolotow. Another person who may be joining us via the network is Susan Hirschman, who offered our featured speaker his first contract and edited many of his books at Green Willow HarperCollins. If you're out there in the digital ether, Ms. Hirschman, we want you to know how many of us in the room are grateful to you for recognizing Kevin Henkes' promise. More importantly, there are a lot of children who would thank you if they knew the connection. Actually, here with us in analog form tonight is Virginia Duncan, Kevin Henkes' present editor at Green Willow HarperCollins. Ms. Duncan, perhaps you'd wave so that people know who you are. We're very pleased that you could be here, Virginia Duncan, and thank you for coming. We at the School of Education are proud to be the home of the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the CCBC, in partnership with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Appropriately, the CCBC is located in Helen C. White Hall. Technically, it is a non-circulating collection of children's books, both current and historical. However, the hardworking staff at the CCBC have made it much more than that. It is a truly extraordinary resource for parents, teachers, and librarians. The CCBC disseminates the understanding and appreciation of children's literature while also helping to ensure that the intellectual freedom that we Americans claim as our birthright extends to young readers. More than any other single individual, it has been Virginia Moore Cruz who has built the CCBC to its present stature. Ginny retired this year after serving as director for 26 years. She and her husband John are also with us tonight. Please stand, Ginny, so that we can try to thank you. As we all know, there is a great deal of talk and even some action these days about children's reading. We measure our progress toward this goal with tests that assess competency or proficiency. But beyond proficiency, there is a higher goal that might be described as excitement. The thrill that comes from using your recently acquired proficiency to read something that really engages your imagination and your mind. In addition to good reading by children, there is good reading for children. And that's where authors, illustrators, publishers, booksellers, librarians, parents, and the CCBC come in. One thing that a really outstanding director does is to nurture younger colleagues who will sustain the momentum when the director decides to retire. Ginny Moore Cruz did that too. and we are extremely fortunate that Catherine T. Horning, Katie, has agreed to lead the CCBC. She and her colleague Megan Schlesman have stepped up to fill the enormous gap left by Ginny's retirement and are carrying on and continuing to improve the full range of CCBC services. They are loyal and generous people, but most of all, they are expert librarians who can advance the CCBC's distinguished record and its vital agenda. It is now my pleasure to introduce Catherine T. Horning, Interim Director of the Cooperative Children's Book Center. Katie?
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Cooperative Children's Book Center, the staff at the CCBC, my colleagues Megan Schlesman and Mary Lindgren, and the recently retired Ginny Moore Cruz, I would like to welcome you all to the 5th annual Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. Tonight, Kevin Henkes joins an ever-growing line of distinguished guest lecturers who have included Carla Cuskin, Catherine Patterson, Jean Craighead George, and Robert Lipsyte. Many people make the Charlotte Zolotow Lecture possible, including all of the donors to the UW Foundation's Charlotte Zolotow Fund, whose names you'll find listed in the back of your programs. I'd also like to acknowledge the ongoing support of the Friends of the CCBC. When you walked in, you may have noticed Friends membership table, and if you're not already a member of the Friends, please do think of joining. In addition to the great satisfaction Friends members get from helping to support the Charlotte Zolotow Lecture and Award, they also get a very nicely printed limited edition with the full text of the Charlotte Zolotow Lecture each year, in addition to a copy of CCBC Choices delivered to your door. When you walked in, you may have also noticed tables with some of Kevin Henkes' books for sale, and we'd like to thank Canterbury Booksellers for making these books available to you tonight, for any of you who would like to have books signed after the lecture. And there is one last person who makes the Charlotte Zolotow Lecture possible, and that is Charlotte Zolotow herself. I spoke with Charlotte this morning, and she sends you all her greetings from her home in New York. And now I'm going to turn things over to Professor Phil Hamilton of the Art Department of the UW-Madison School of Education, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Katie. This is a real treat for me because Kevin was one of my students when I was a teacher, or I'm still a teacher here, years ago. So think of it, I'm sure there's teachers out here, the treat of getting to introduce a former student who's become so famous and successful. In 1983, Kevin Henkes enrolled in my typography and graphic design course at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I could tell that Kevin was an unusual student because he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. You know, most students who come to my class at this stage don't have a clue what they want to pursue. He wanted to write and illustrate children's books. Kevin already knew about the CCBC. That's another thing I always have to tell my students about the CCBC, but in Kevin's case, I didn't have to, because he already knew about the CCBC. He had met Ginny Moore Cruz. His favorite hometown librarian in Racine, Nancy Elsmo, had told Kevin about the CCBC and already done the introduction. So before he started taking courses in the art department, Kevin had already decided he wanted to be an artist and writer, and he had his first book, All Alone, published by Green Willow Press. So while attending the UW-Madison, Kevin studied with distinguished faculty affiliated with many different departments and schools, carefully selecting classes he knew that would help him prepare for his chosen field. In the art department, for example, he studied drawing with John Wilde. It was the last year John Wilde taught here. Book arts with Walter Hamady. He took a course in curriculum and instruction in children's literature with Jack Keane. And he even was able to enroll, I don't know how he accomplished this, in a graduate library school seminar on heroes and heroines in literature taught by Gertrude Ehrman. So he has continued to pursue the objectives he set for himself for more than 20 years, achieving along the way a remarkable record of honors and public recognition. To date, Kevin has published 21 picture books and 8 novels. His Owen has received at least 12 national awards, including being selected as a Caldecott Honor Book in 1994. His Lily's Purple Plastic Purse, the American Bookseller's hit pick of 1997, achieved still broader public recognition as a successful children's theater production that was performed at the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And then it was specially commissioned as a musical program that appeared here in Madison and Racine. Kevin's characters have become as familiar and memorable as Babar and Cat in the Hat. Kevin's books are a pleasure to read for both children and their parents. He combines interesting storytelling with careful attention to the continuity of words and images. And only rarely these days are books both written and illustrated by the same person, I think. And in Kevin's case, by a person who also has the book art production skills and who pays attention, as Kathleen Horning has noted, to details such as typography, page layout, and design. So this attention, Kevin's careful scrutiny of these and related issues have resulted in books of outstanding aesthetic quality. So while his teachers at UW-Madison can't claim to have influenced the direction of his career, we hope that he gained something of value from his experiences here. And Kevin, as has been pointed out in the previous PR and by Dean Reed, Kevin joins a growing list of distinguished children's book authors and illustrators with strong UW ties. Tonight's lecture, for example, is named to honor Charlotte Zolotow, a children's book editor with Harper Junior Books for many years and the author of more than 65 picture books. Other notable authors and illustrators with UW connections, whose books Kevin probably discovered back in Racine or here at the CCBC, include the work of Nancy Ekholm Burkert and Ellen Raskin. So, the title of Kevin's lecture tonight, An Equivalent Happiness, Making It Out of Childhood, is the 5th Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. Please join me in a warm University of Wisconsin-Madison homecoming welcome for Kevin Henkes.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all for coming. It's nice to see so many friendly, familiar faces. I've been in my field officially, professionally, for just over 22 years, and tonight I'm going to do 2 things that I've never done before. Number 1, I'm going to give a talk without using slides, and I feel slightly naked. And I'm going to do that because number 2, I'm going to give a talk in which I don't speak about my picture books at all. I'm only going to be talking about my novels for children. And it's strange, when I'm out in the big world, it's always my picture books that people seem to know best and love most, when in fact, and I'm not sure why, it is the novels that are most near and dear to my heart. So tonight, I'm devoting to the novels, and I'm calling this An Equivalent Happiness, Making It Out of Childhood. Giving speeches or lectures named after someone can be tricky business. I was once asked to give the Anne Carroll Moore Lecture at the New York Public Library. I was honored to have been asked, but I had a shaky relationship with Anne Carroll Moore. I'd never met her, of course, except through articles and stories, but I knew of her thorny connections to some of my favorite books. She infamously was not entirely fond of the Little House books, nor Stuart Little, nor Charlotte's Web, all of which I admire greatly. I had a difficult time getting beyond this. I said yes to the lecture and delivered it without one mention of Anne Carroll Moore, feeling slightly guilty throughout. No such problem exists for me with the Charlotte Zolotow Lecture. I admire the books Charlotte Zolotow has written and those she has edited, and although I've only met her a handful of times and briefly, I admire the person as well. And digressing, I admit, I must say I love her voice and her hair. Her voice, soft but magnetic, her hair like spun pearls and equally magnetic. The first time we met, I shook her hand, but it was her hair I wanted to touch. When I was a young boy, I was intrigued by a pair of bird statues my maternal grandmother had. They were glass, clear, colored. One was sapphire blue, the other amber. The birds were smooth and slender and curved, with long legs and delicate beaks. Tiny bubbles were trapped inside the forms, as if the bubbles had been frozen as they traveled up the birds' graceful necks. I admired the birds. They seemed exquisite and mysterious. Perhaps, due to my limited experience, they were art. I remember asking my mother why we didn't have birds like Grandma's at our house. My mother told me that she didn't particularly like birds, except outside, in trees. This little exchange has stuck with me for years. I can hear the words in my head, in my mother's voice. It's part of my past that, for whatever reason, remains very clear. It wasn't until many years later when, as a student of children's books, I rediscovered Mr. Rabbit and the Lovely Present by Charlotte Zolotow, illustrated by Maurice Sendak. And I wondered if my mother's response had been inspired by Charlotte's book. When Mr. Rabbit suggests to the little girl that a cardinal or a canary or a bluebird might make a nice present for her mother's birthday, the little girl disagrees. She likes birds and trees, the little girl said. Mr. Rabbit and the Lovely Present was a book my family checked out of the library regularly. It's familiar. I remember it the way one remembers a smell or wallpaper or a pattern on a favorite cereal bowl or other similar familiar things from childhood. And as an author, I have been told by families that lines from some of my books have become part of their daily conversations, and that certain catchphrases have been incorporated into their lives, assuming a place in the family vocabulary. She likes birds and trees, the little girl said. I like thinking it was Charlotte who had seeped into our lives through her words. Books can do that. I feel this link to Charlotte Zolotow, a link that stretches back nearly 40 years, and so I'm delighted to speak tonight as part of the annual event marked by her name and spirit. By reading the book Charlotte Zolotow has written and those she has edited, one can tell that she respects children. She knows children are complex and varied. She knows they can be bundles of contradiction, tinderboxes of emotion. She knows that childhood is anything but an endless stream of carefree days. It is more like a complicated knot, difficult to undo. I couldn't agree more. So, from the very start, I'll state, childhood is not easy, even under the best of circumstances, and making it out of childhood, making it through to the other side, is a journey hard fought. Listen to Charlotte Zolotow. This is her poem called The Puzzle. So much of every day, it is a mystery, but maybe the puzzle of it is just me. And another poem by Charlotte, The Crickets. The crickets fill the night with their voices. It is like a message in another language spoken to a part of me who hasn't happened yet. The puzzle of it is just me, a part of me who hasn't happened yet. These two phrases are simple, accurate descriptions of what it feels like to be young, but conscious of something beyond one's own handful of years. Simple, accurate descriptions of what it feels like to have one foot still rooted in childhood, the other taking testing steps, hoping for something else, something firm to stand on and for. These two phrases reflect the awareness of the speakers and indicate the presence of self-examination. The speakers are uncertain, but aware enough to articulate this uncertainty. This suggests a particular level of maturity. The speakers have entered the maze that ends at adulthood. This searching is what I like to explore in my novels for children. All my main characters feel as if they are puzzles yet to be completed, or that part of them hasn't happened yet. They are on the verge of experiencing something new, and they are vulnerable, and they most often work undercover, keeping their thoughts and desires and feelings under wraps. Contrary to what we are often led to believe by marketing campaigns and images from the popular culture, this uncertainty or figuring out or solving of the puzzle lasts a good long time. There are no shortcuts to adulthood, short of moving heaven and earth. The small changes that occur within the long search are sometimes slow, but sometimes sudden, or realized suddenly after the fact and seen as markers. Sometimes changes are made deliberately, and because it's a time filled with such ambivalence, moving on also means losing something and can be bittersweet. The following passage is from my book, Son and Spoon. In the scene, Spoon is watching his father, Scott, interact with Spoon's little sister, Joni. Spoon is 10, but already starting to move on, becoming more grown up. Scott came up behind Joni, scooped her up, kissed her, flipped her onto his shoulder, then flipped her back down to the ground. Her hood fell off as she spun through the air, and her disheveled hair looked like a feather duster. Joni squealed. Scott used to do the same thing to Spoon, but Spoon was too big for that now, although they still wrestled, which was much more dignified. Spoon wondered how it was that he had outgrown being flipped. Did it happen all of a sudden, overnight? One day, did everyone just know that flips would no longer be a routine activity for him? It struck him that there had to have been a last flip, although he could never have known that fact as he turned that final turn from his father's shoulder. As hard as he tried to remember, he had no idea when his last flip had occurred. And this scene is from my forthcoming novel, Olive's Ocean. 12-year-old Martha is on the beach with Jimmy Manning, a 14-year-old boy she's interested in. Inconspicuously at first, Martha dug in the sand with just a couple fingers. Then she pinched together a ragged wall, encircling the small hole she had hollowed out. Next, she started a tower, making wide arcs with her arms to gather the sand and using both hands as scoops. Castle? Asked Jimmy. There was a groove of skepticism near his mouth. Want to help? Said Martha. His eyes were like insects, flitting all around. He didn't answer, but he got on his hands and knees and joined in. Just so you know, said Jimmy, no self-respecting 14-year-old would be cut dead making a sandcastle without a little kid with them. Do you want me to get my sister? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying I'm doing this for you. Don't do it for me. Okay, for us. Martha smiled, a bit sheepishly. The funny thing was, Martha did like sandcastles. Not just the idea of them, but the actual building of them as well. Was it weird, she wondered? Was she too old for this? She also liked making paper chains and collecting snow globes. Perhaps most childish, she enjoyed arranging her many small containers of lip gloss by color on her bed, or organizing them into families. She'd pair the right colors and fragrances to form perfect unions. Then there'd be births. This was Martha's favorite part of the game, deciding who was born to whom. Then the children would marry and it would all begin again, until it looked as if Martha were diagramming an elaborate military maneuver on her bedspread. She taught the game to Lucy, legitimizing it, making it a nice, kind thing for a big sister to do with her baby sister. But she vowed then and there, on the beach with Jimmy Manning, to give it up. She'd never do it again. She was too old for that now, definitely. But sandcastles were a different story. Oh. I was still feeling the lingering incompleteness of my young self when I was lucky enough to be given the chance to be a published writer and illustrator, a heady enough prospect for anyone, much less a 19-year-old. In what now seems like a dream, I flew from my childhood home in Wisconsin to New York City, and within a few days, Susan Hirschman of Green Willow Books offered me a contract for what became my first picture book. During my first years as a Green Willow author, I was not unlike a seedling in a small paper cup, a scraggly, unguarded thing, the kind both my children have proudly brought home from preschool. It was Susan Hirschman who tended to all my needs and taught me how, I'll never really understand, what I needed to know to create books for children. Although it was picture books I first delved into, it wasn't long before Susan encouraged me to write something longer. My early attempts at a novel were painful to execute and mercifully went unpublished. I couldn't seem to gain distance from my material. I couldn't get the larger vision I needed. Through all the writing and rewriting and throwing away, through all the discouragement that clouded my work life, I persevered in part because I wanted to do it so badly, but also because of Susan. She encouraged me regularly. She'd call and ask, "Are you writing?" And if I said yes, she'd say, "Read it to me." She'd also sent me a letter during this bleak time, part of which said, and I can still quote it by heart, "I have never doubted that you are a real writer, so the fact that you are writing a real novel comes as no surprise." I reread the letter often, daily. I folded it and carried it with me. It was a good luck charm, a talisman. I still have it, of course, in my studio, tucked safely into my drawer of favorite things. I bring it out on occasion, unfold it, and read. I finally wrote that first longer book, and now I've just finished my 8th novel for children. It's not any easier to write now than it was then, and although I learn a lot with each book, the next book is always new and poses its own set of problems. I have discovered, however, looking back, that there is some kind of pattern to the way I work. At least I begin the same way. About 10 years ago, I ripped a Talk of the Town piece out of the New Yorker magazine to save. The article was about a show at the Children's Museum of Manhattan called Great Stuff, which featured collections assembled by children. Andrew S. Ackerman, the executive director of the museum at that time, had this to say about the show. Developmentally, kids generally start collecting at around age 5 or 6. They do it for one reason: because a collection is a world they can control. You know, a lot of kids nowadays have nothing they can control, so in them the instinct becomes more intense than ever. A collection is theirs. They created it. They decide if it's good. It's an expression of who they are. This makes sense to me, and it's a good analogy, collecting as a way to have power in a powerless world, and childhood is certainly that, a powerless world. Some of my characters collect things, particularly Fanny from Protecting Marie, who has a file cabinet in her room in which she stores things that are important to her. In Words of Stone, Blaze collects rocks, one each year, marking time since the death of his mother. Others, like Spoon from Sun and Spoon and Martha from Olive's Ocean, are searching with different levels of awareness for one small but very important object that represents for them someone or something big. The object they think will give them some kind of control, help both of them understand death, help both of them overcome their feelings of powerlessness. As a writer, I often feel powerless during the beginning stages of a book, during the time when I'm creating my characters, and so I collect, literally. As readers, I think we take characters in novels for granted. A character in a novel, one clearly and generously defined, is more revealed to us than are those people we are closest to. It's true, because an author shares not only the exterior lives of his or her characters, but also the interior lives. People in novels are stripped of their disguises and pretenses and are left with little or no privacy, no secrets. We see them as they truly are. Janet Malcolm calls this the glaring exposure to which the souls of fictional characters are regularly held up. And how lucky we are as readers. We get to see people in a way in which we never see the real people who fill our lives. But people in books are symbols, of course, and a book has built-in restrictions. A character in a book must be captured in great economy. The poet Friedrich Schiller observed that man is made of ordinary things, which brings me back to collecting. I collect things, ordinary things, for my characters. As my collecting builds, so too do my characters. Before I begin to write, I think about my characters for months, usually years. I keep a notebook with pockets and a folder in which I collect. And I have a shelf in my studio on which objects pertaining to my main character accrue. My collections have included things such as photographs, often family photographs, maps, postcards, reproductions of famous paintings, coins, keys, a stone, and newspaper clippings. Everything matters when creating a character, things both external and internal, things both obvious and not so obvious. William Trevor, one of my favorite writers, tells us, by the end, you should be inside your character, actually operating from within somebody else and knowing him pretty well, as that person knows himself or herself. You're sort of a predator, an invader of people. Among other things, a character needs a name, a past, a temperament, life circumstances, a place, a home or lack of one. What is his or her family like? Are there parents? What do they do? Are there grandparents? I need to know if my character has siblings and how many. I consider birth order, years between siblings. Creating a middle child is different than creating an only child or a twin. Creating an orphan, different still. A character needs likes and dislikes, fears, favorite possessions, quirks. Does she have a favorite coat? Does he have a favorite food? Does she turn rigid at the sight of a particular teacher? Does he pale during thunderstorms? Does she tug her ear when she worries? Does he have an imaginary friend? Does she have real friends? Is he a late riser, an early riser? A character needs physical attributes too: height, weight, shape, hair color, eye color, skin color. The list goes on and on. You get the idea. The writer might not state all these things explicitly, but he needs to know them. As W. Somerset Maugham has written, you can never know enough about your characters. And each of these characteristics and circumstances has layers, of course. Consider something like a name. What are its origins? What does it mean? Sometimes it is what the name looks and sounds like that is important. How many syllables does it have? Does it look right in print? Does it have the right connotations? Does it sound right for the character, fit his or her personality? For example, in Protecting Marie, my main character's name is Fanny Swan. Fanny is Teutonic and means free. I thought this was the perfect foil for her. She feels exactly the opposite. She feels completely controlled by her father. Fanny, the name, sounded elegant to me, which I liked, and it lent itself to good nicknames, Fancy and Fan, which I used sparingly, but which were nonetheless very important. Her last name is Swann, S-W-A-N-N. There is the allusion to Proust, but also, and more importantly, it hits at what lies beyond for Fanny. She thinks she's awkward, gawky, average, unpretty. Again, a foil. She is an ugly duckling. Symbolically, I gave her hope when I gave her her name. So I have to answer all these questions, and I have to find a voice for my character and keep that voice consistent. And I have to love him or her enough to live with him or her for every day, for months, and even years. Now I'll talk about parts of my collections for different books of mine. The creative process is difficult to explain. I hope these examples shed a bit of light on how it all works. For my book Sun and Spoon, I collected, among other things, a map of Oregon, postcards from the Oregon coast, and more importantly, a fork, a deck of cards with suns on them that had been in my family for years and in my possession for at least a decade, and a few photographs of my mother-in-law's collection of suns. She's got hundreds of them hanging in her house. They're made of clay, stained glass, metal, wood. Those of you who are familiar with Sun and Spoon know that Graham collected suns and had a favorite deck of cards with suns printed on them. The cards prove crucial to the plot of the story. The fork's place in the book is less straightforward. When my wife and I were making a garden in the backyard of our first house, we found a child's fork buried in the dirt, unearthing a piece of someone's history. The fork seemed to be fairly old. A fancy-looking little girl was on the handle, and the name Rilla engraved on the back. I kept the fork in my studio, thinking I'd use it somehow, someday. My wife and I even joked at the time that if we ever had a daughter, we could call her Rilla. Years passed, and although the fork transformed into a spoon in my mind's eye, spoon sounds much nicer for a child's nickname than does fork, but it became the essential something from which the entire book grew. If I hadn't found that fork, there would never have been Sun and Spoon. I would have written an entirely different book. Reading the following passage from the book explains better than I can how this weaving together of a small real-life incident and invented circumstances manifests itself. Names were funny things. His certainly was. His name was Frederick, but everyone called him Spoon. He hated it when he had to tell someone the story of his name. Spoon, people would say upon hearing his name for the first time. They always had the same pinched look on their faces. Many people had tried to guess the origin of his name, but none had ever guessed correctly. He doubted if anyone ever would. One morning when Spoon's mother was pregnant with him, she decided to plant some peonies in the side yard. The peonies had been divided from a plant of grams and were at least a half a century old. Kay had only been digging for minutes when her shovel hit something that clinked. She bent down, reached into the shallow hole, and found a tarnished baby spoon peeking out of the dirt. A young, lanky boy with thick curls wearing a sailor suit and holding a hobby horse was embossed on the handle of the spoon, and the name Frederick was engraved into the back of the handle in an elegant script. As Kay cleaned the spoon with the hem of her gardening smock, she felt the baby kick for the first time. She made up her mind then and there that if her baby was a boy, he would be named Frederick. Following Frederick's birth, friends and neighbors asked where his name had come from. Was he named for an uncle, a great-grandfather? After telling the story time and again, Scott and Kay started calling Frederick Spoon Baby, and then simply Spoon. Charlie took to it quickly. Spoon, or Poon, as he pronounced it, rolled off his 2-year-old tongue with much greater ease than did Frederick. He loved the ooh sound. Soon, Spoon was the only name anyone called the baby, and now when Spoon heard the name Frederick, it barely registered with him, barely caused his head to turn. Sometimes when he was asked, he lied and said that Spoon was a nickname for Spooner, his given name, an old family name on his mother's side. The spoon lay on Kay's dresser amid a dusty jumble, hairpins, rubber bands, foreign coins, beads, stone fruit. I'll give it to you, she told him once, when you're old enough for it to mean something to you. My collection for protecting Marie included 2 gifts from Susan. One was an advent calendar, the other a mug. I gave both items to my character, Fanny. The mug had belonged to Susan. It is ceramic. A mother kangaroo and a joey are painted on one side, the words love and happiness on the other. I feel the same way about the mug as I do about Susan's letter. I had wanted to incorporate the mug into a book of mine for years, but only if it was exactly right. With Fanny, I found a way. The moment in the book is brief, but it underscores Fanny's conflicted feelings about her father. Out of this one small object sprang forth so much, so many details that helped form Fanny. Here's a small excerpt. When the water was ready, Fanny rinsed out her favorite mug and made strawberry tea in it. She had used it earlier for hot chocolate. The mug had been her favorite for as long as she could remember. Fanny didn't know who had given it to her. The mug was handmade, thrown on a wheel, the potter's illegible signature scratched sharply into the bottom. On one side there was a kangaroo with a pointy joey peeking out of its pouch. On the other side the words love and happiness were painted on in bouncy cursive writing. Once when Henry was in a particularly cranky mood and had been hounding Fanny about her table manners throughout the course of an entire dinner, Fanny held the mug up to him and said, "See, there's no father kangaroo. That's why it's my favorite cup. And that's why it says love and happiness." Then she stormed out of the dining room without having any dessert. Fanny couldn't use the mug without thinking of that incident, and yet the mug remained her favorite, even when she regarded Henry as the best father ever and her only champion in the world. Words of Stone is one book of mine in which I used a major incident from my life. When I was 5, my legs were burned while I waited to go on a carnival ride on the 4th of July. The fire was due to a problem with the ride's electrical system. I have 3 small, square, black and white photos of me from that day, one taken before the accident and 2 taken afterward, which show my bandaged legs. These photos were the beginning of my collection for Words of Stone. Also in my collection of odds and ends for Words of Stone was a copy of a Thomas Buick woodcut from The History of British Birds, Volume 1, published in 1797. The vignette is labeled Children Playing on Tombstones and is typical of Buick's memento mori pieces. The image is of 4 children wearing hats sitting atop tombstones. One child is blowing a horn, the other 3 are holding swords. I alluded to this image in a scene in the book. The scene is very short, but key. It emphasizes Blaze's personality and embodies the essence of the book's themes and motifs. When he was in second grade, Blaze had found a picture of a cemetery in a big book at the school library. He couldn't remember the name of the book, and although he had looked for it again several times, he never found it. The picture was of 4 boys sitting on tombstones, riding them as if they were horses. The boys were wearing hats and blowing trumpets, as Blaze recalled it. The picture frightened him the day he saw it, and he always thought of it when he came to the cemetery. He could never do what the boys in the picture were doing, but he could imagine Joselle doing it. He saw her clearly, Joselle hopping onto a gravestone, clicking her heels and whooping, wearing a loopy grin on her face and an outrageous hat on her head. It didn't seem wrong for Joselle. A small wooden chair with uneven legs and chipped paint was the centerpiece of my collection for the birthday room. I discovered the chair in my parents' basement on a weekend visit after I was married. In fact, my wife was pregnant, and I thought it would be nice to have the chair for our child. My grandfather had made the chair. We brought the chair home, and there it sat. I worked on other things. And then, when my son was an infant, something happened that, combined with the chair, became what I needed to start the birthday room. My son was no more than a few months old. I was home alone with him. He was in his bassinet, which was set up next to a window. He loved to watch the shadow of leaves from the small tree outside play across the canvas window shade. The shade was pulled about halfway down on this particular day. I checked on him about every 1.5 minutes, worry-plagued first-time parent that I was. But after about 8 checks, he seemed perfectly fine, so I decided to do the dishes. When I went back in to check on him again, perhaps 5 minutes later at most, he was asleep, his head turned away from the window. But the sunlight had crept below the bottom edge of the shade and was shining directly on his face. My heartbeat quickened. I squatted and lowered my head to the exact level of my son's head and looked out the window. The sun was shining right in my eyes. I panicked. I thought that I might have blinded my son. I knew that I had. I didn't know exactly when he had fallen asleep. What if he had stared at the sun? I quickly woke him up. I tested him. I got him to lock eyes with me, and then I moved without speaking to see if he'd follow me with his eyes. He did. Then I took one of his favorite toys and moved it in an arc around his head to see if he'd follow it. Again, he did. He reached for it. I felt a momentary wash of relief, but the panic returned. This was a Saturday. I telephoned our doctor's office and told my awful story and concerns to the nurse who answered my call. My breathing was shallow and my heart was pounding in my throat. I felt like a criminal confessing a crime. The nurse asked, "Is this your first child?" "Yes," I said, thinking this was absolutely beside the point. "I thought so," she said. The nurse was perfectly calm, and I remember thinking that she didn't understand the enormity of what had happened. "Does he respond to you?" she asked. "Yes." "Is he irritable? Is he crying, rubbing his eyes?" "No." "You know, this is why we have eyelids," she said. "To protect the eyes." And I'm guessing his head was turned away from the sun for a reason. She told me not to worry, but if I needed to call back, I should. She ended by saying something else about being a first-time parent again. I detected amusement in her voice. I felt relieved once again, but the panicky feeling crept back and was raging by the time my wife arrived home. What if the damage was slow to reveal itself and long-lasting in its effects? I confessed the whole thing. I expected my wife to be upset, very upset. Was divorce in my future? But she burst out laughing and proceeded to call her mother and sister to tell my funny story. Many others soon heard the story as well. I can laugh about it now, but it took me a long time to arrive at that place. But what I came to think about was this. What would happen if an infant was injured in some way while in the care of a loving adult? I wondered, what if the child grew up unconcerned about it, but the incident had left a mark on the adults in the child's life? I had these thoughts, I had my chair, and soon I had this paragraph, which became the first paragraph of the second chapter of The Birthday Room. When Benjamin Hunter was 2.5 years old, the little finger on his left hand was cut off in an accident. The accident happened while his uncle was babysitting him. They were in his uncle's basement workshop. His uncle had dropped out of college, traveled for a couple of years, and had been teaching himself how to build furniture. On that bleak January day, his uncle was finishing a chair for Ben. How this process works is beyond me, but somehow it does. In a recent article in the New York Times, the novelist Katherine Harrison wrote, "In my life as a writer, I often remind myself, comfort myself, with what William Faulkner said about the sound and the fury. The whole novel, he claimed, hung on one image, the glimpse of a little girl's muddy underpants seen from the ground as she climbed a tree. How can an entire world spin off so small and incidental a hub? Can it be possible that Faulkner conceived his masterpiece from this tiny, grubby moment?" Harrison continued, "I imagine most writers of novels begin with such a fragment, a shard of experience so compelling, so troubling and unavoidable, always there on the periphery of consciousness, that around it he or she must construct an elaborate world. This world, the novel, is not merely a container or a means of filing the image away, but an attempt to make it comprehensible and to guard its power." And in the introduction to the vintage paperback edition of her selected stories, Alice Munro writes, "The story I am working on now owes its existence mostly to a long straight path, a hard-beaten dirt path running between a double row of spruce trees. I know now who walked that path and where they were going, but in the beginning there was just a path." Olive's Ocean, which will come out in the fall of 2003, owes its existence to a homemade snow globe made of an empty baby food jar and a plastic snowman given to my son by a neighbor friend. I saw the thing on my son's dresser daily. It wasn't long before the plastic snowman had come unattached and lay face down in the jar like a specimen of some sort. And the water level had gone down considerably. To me, it had become a forlorn little object. I kept thinking about it. I took out the snowman in my mind's eye and I asked myself, why would a kid have a baby food jar of water on his or her dresser? Where did it come from? Was it a gift? From whom? Some of the questions no longer apply, but I have a new book in part because of that homemade snow globe. Once I figured out where the jar came from, who would fill it and with what, and who would be the recipient and why, I began developing a narrative. Then I had to devise meaningful ways to weave my jar into the fabric of the narrative without calling too much attention to it at first. This is the first scene in which I started to lay the groundwork. Martha and her family, the Boyles, are at her grandmother's house. She lives on Cape Cod. The grandmother is called Godby. It is the first night of the family's vacation. The characters are Martha, her parents, her older brother Vince, her younger sister Lucy, and Godby. Martha's father's mood didn't improve at dinner. Lucy threw a full-fledged tantrum because they had no banana baby food for her to eat. "I want bananas." "Damn," said her father. "We used the last jar on the plane." "Didn't you pack extras?" asked Martha's mother. "I can't always think of everything," her father snapped back, a crack of anger in his voice. "There are bananas on the counter," said Godby. "I'll mash one up." "Forget it, Mom. She won't eat it." Lucy was a picky eater. Banana baby food was one thing she currently liked. "Bananas," screamed Lucy. "I want bananas." She was rocking back and forth in her chair, which was piled with books so that she could reach the table. Her face grew red and redder. Her lips formed ugly shapes. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Banana, banana, banana." "Stop it," her father commanded, pounding the table. "I said stop it." The tiny kitchen shook. Something clattered. Lucy became hysterical. Her jerky movements shifted the stack of books she was perched on, and she and the books tumbled from the chair. She kicked one of the table legs. She flung her arms about. In an instant, Martha's mother was on the floor, cradling Lucy, her arms circling Lucy's wriggling body, massaging it, as if by doing so, the rage would be absorbed, transferred from daughter to mother. "We're definitely on vacation now," said Vince. "I can feel every muscle relaxing." "Who needs meditation when you can be with the Boyles? Even my baby toenails are relaxing." Martha looked around the room. She hated everyone except Godby. She hated Lucy for being so fussy. She hated her father for losing his temper. She hated Vince for being sarcastic in front of Godby. She hated her mother for not fixing everything. Wasn't a mother supposed to fix everything, make everything perfect? Lucy quieted. She was whimpering and hiccuping. "I happy now," she moaned between two great heaves of her chest. "I'll go to the store as soon as she's completely calmed down," said Martha's mother. "I can take her with me." "No, I'm going," said Martha's father. "I'm going alone. I'm going right now. I'm gone." After the door slammed, in a moment of awkward stillness, there was a moment of giddiness in which Martha giggled silently and Vince twirled his spoon, smirking, and Lucy squeaked gleefully, "Where's Papa? Where he hiding?" And then it was as if nothing at all out of the ordinary had happened. "Please pass the salt, Vincent," said Godby. "This soup is a bit bland." A baby food jar, Fanny's mug, the origin of Spoon's name, Ben's chair. As these kinds of details or incidents build, a character assumes mass and depth and weight. We readers start to see a heart, a soul, a real person, a life. And no matter how flawed or unsure or complicated a character in a book may be, magically, a character in a book is always there, reliable to a fault, constant, just waiting, always ready to be revealed. I've been told by more than a few young readers that I often include the following in my novels: breakfast, summertime, kids who have a hard time sleeping, and trips. Many of these young readers had been assigned to look for themes and motifs in my books and then to write to me and tell me what they had found. Initially, the observations surprised me. I hadn't consciously incorporated these things into my books, but I discovered that the students were correct. These things do appear and repeat in my books. I can't explain except to say that I love breakfast. When I remember my childhood, summertime seems to hold sway in my memory. I am a very light sleeper, and I always wanted to travel as a child, but rarely did, and the very few little trips we did take were huge in every way for me and are still memorable. As a writer, I'm sure that I reach back to certain places within me without realizing it, because they are what I know and feel comfortable with. The one observation that seems most noteworthy is the one about trips. I've read somewhere that there are only two plots in fiction. Someone goes on a trip, or a stranger comes to town. Sometimes my characters do go on trips. In The Birthday Room, Ben goes to visit his uncle. In Olive's Ocean, Martha goes to visit her grandmother, as does Joselle in Words of Stone. But sometimes my characters stay home. Fanny and Spoon, to name two, who, not so incidentally, each have an opportunity to take a trip, but after much agonizing, decide not to. Trips have their allure, of course, but so too does staying home. Sometimes, surprisingly, it is by staying home that greater awareness is gained. It arrives in town like a stranger. Perhaps there are only two plots, or perhaps these incidents or plot devices in my books reflect my ambivalence, go versus stay. Man has two equally strong inclinations. One is habit, the other is change, wrote Jean de la Bruyere. Adults, not children, have often noted that adults are present in my books, prominently so. This confuses them, adults. I think it would be strange not to include adults, to assume that young readers don't want adults in their books, and if they do, that they expect them to be blatantly self-centered and one-dimensional, obviously bad, seems misguided to me. It seems to be a case of underestimating young readers. Even when young people feel alienated from the world at large, and adults specifically, adults still exist and play a big role in life, often a positive one, and so I put them in my books. Back to Charlotte Zolotow. She puts adults in her books. This is her poem called Grown-Ups. Do mothers ever feel lonely? Do fathers ever feel sad? I want mine to be the way they want me, happy and glad. Another of Charlotte's poems, My Mother. My mother doesn't always know what I am thinking, but I can very often tell what's in her head by the things she hasn't said. In her memoir, Breaking Clean, about growing up on a Montana ranch, Judy Blunt writes, "There were so many things I knew without knowing why, things I learned as a child, listening with half an ear to all that was said, and most intently to all that was not said. I remember the silence most of all. Things left unsaid, silences, wondering about parents and wanting them to be something they're not, ambivalence, embarrassment. All these things exist fiercely in the world between childhood and adulthood, along with sadness and searching and longing, deep longing. The poet John Berryman called this change in life the mysterious conversion of a child into a person. Because this conversion is so mysterious, it's difficult to capture it on the page. I try my best by carefully choosing details, building my characters phrase by phrase, bone by bone, molecule by molecule. And I am continually drawn to set the conversion, or more accurately, a piece of it, within a middle-class family in a medium-sized Midwestern city. This setting, although there is a shift in nuance within the framework from book to book, is what I know best and love most. I think of the families in my books as flawed but loving, imperfect but surely not beyond repair, occasionally operating on shaky ground but mostly doing so on firm footing. So it gave me pause when I read one of a set of questions for a written online interview I agreed to do after my book, The Birthday Room, was published. The question read, "The Birthday Room, like many of your books, deals with estrangement between family members. Is there a reason why you keep exploring this subject? What's your own relationship with your family like?" I remember feeling annoyed and misunderstood after reading the question. My answer was rather terse. I wrote, "I love exploring family relationships. My novels are often about finding one's place in the world and within a family, a difficult thing for many adolescents and pre-adolescents to do. I grew up with 2 parents and 4 siblings, and we still live close to and are close to one another, period." I still find it strange that the interviewer chose the word estrangement to describe what happens in my fictional families. It seems too harsh a word, too severe, and not the right word to capture the essence of what my families are about. Years ago, I came across Joseph Mitchell's description of William Maxwell's work. Joseph Mitchell said, "William Maxwell's principal theme, like James Joyce's, is the sadness that exists at the heart of a family." I'm in no way comparing myself to the great beloved William Maxwell nor James Joyce, but when I read these words, something resonated in me, and I thought, this is what I want my books to be about. Sadness that often exists at the heart of a family is not only more poetic sounding than estrangement between family members, but also is open, allowing for nuance and a wide scale on which the emotion can play out. Sadness within a family has many shadings, from spilled milk and broken crayons to broken promises, from lost blankets to lost respect, from apologies left unspoken to second guessing to the chill of unexpressed emotion, from misguided acts of love to misinterpreted anger, from undeserved gain to unexpected loss. Estrangement can be part of this sadness, but it is different. It's limited. Sadness is compounded, I think, during adolescence and pre-adolescence. In his role as New Yorker editor, William Maxwell wrote to the British writer Sylvia Townsend Warner in 1973 about her latest collection of short stories. In his letter, he listed his favorite characters and their predicaments, and then concluded by saying this of the stories: "They are formal and ironic, but they are also unguarded and unafraid, and all this makes for a special kind of sadness. They are terribly sad in a way that suggests an equivalent happiness somewhere nearby." This is the way I've now come to look at childhood and adolescence, as a dark, stormy sphere moving along a windy trajectory, complete with dead ends, obstructions, and sharp turns. And at the end of the path, waiting, is a bright, illuminated sphere of the same size, equivalent happiness. It's probably done subconsciously, but it's what gets us through, thinking that it's got to be better on the other side and that the other side is near, thinking that those who have made it are at least as happy as we are sad. I'm now over 40, a parent, middle-aged, and although I think about my mortality more than ever, I wouldn't go back to 10 or 12 or 14 or 17 for anything in the world. To return to William Maxwell. In another letter to Sylvia Townsend Warner, Maxwell wrote about his daughter Kate starting school. These are his words. Emmy, Maxwell's wife, Emmy is going from school to see about entering Kate in some kindergarten next year. The school problem has caught up with us, or is about to. How I rejoice that I will never go to school again. Middle age is the only time one ever has things the exact way one wants them. I don't have things the exact way I want them, not every minute of every day anyway, but I know what William Maxwell meant. I feel it in my bones. I feel it the way I remember feeling that life would get better and better if I could see beyond the awkward, sad, trying patches of childhood and adolescence. Maybe throughout all of life, we sense an equivalent happiness just down the road. Maybe that's what compels us to persevere. Fanny, more than any other character of mine, is a collector. At a critical point near the end of Protecting Marie, she purposely destroys the jewel of her collection, her most important thing. As she gives up control of her collection, she's gaining control of her life. In the last scene in the book, she has a very lucid, optimistic, reflective moment. She feels good about her friends, her parents, and most importantly, herself. She's 12, so she's got a long way to go to reach an equivalent happiness, but she's on her way. The scene is a hopeful one. The last sentence is, "The options were limitless." It is in moments like these that an equivalent happiness seems so near, so possible, seems close enough to touch. Thank you.